Hi, my name is Alex and welcome back to Magic Missile Minis. Today we are going to be putting the dragon in Dungeons and Dragon because we're making one. We're sculpting a dragon. I decided that the best place to start this project would be the head. And this actually took several attempts. Here's my first attempt where I made the head way too big. And this here is my second attempt. This one actually, I found I got the scale roughly correct, but I hadn't focused on the shape I was working on, so when I started adding details, it looked more like facial features on like a square rather than an actual face. You can see here just how flat all of the sides were going to look if I'd continued with this one. But this third try, I actually figured out how to get it right. I start by creating a wire armature that is going to loosely mimic the upper and lower jaw, and I place that onto one of my cork bottles, which I'll use as a kind of sculpting handle. The main problem with my attempts prior was that I wasn't really paying attention to what shape I was making the head at this stage. So what I did here was try to get the basic shape of a snake skull. To be honest, I don't know why I didn't think of that sooner. Rather than thinking I could just make a sock puppet and assume it was going to look like a dragon by the end of it, instead of just a sock puppet with dragon stuff stuck on top. So I add the lower jaw the same way I did the top jaw, just trying to emphasize the major parts of a skull, focusing on the points in the jaws as well as adding the cheekbones, and then I also add these two small pieces of green stuff to act as the eyes later on, pressing them into shape and trying to keep them as round as possible, and making sure that the two eyes are parallel to one another. Next, I was going to add the teeth. The first way I tried to do this was adding the little piece of green stuff at a point and then having it be flush with the rest of the skull I had made. But as I was looking at other dragon designs, I realized that this wasn't going to work super well. A lot of dragon art that I see has the teeth kind of protruding out from the head a little bit, so I decided to do that instead. I also decided I wanted the teeth to not be perfectly symmetrical, partly because it would be a lot easier, but I also just like this style of dragon, especially for the size I'm doing. If I were ever to put this on a table for D&D, it would be a younger dragon and probably one of the more animalistic dragons, so I think having its teeth be a little bit all over the place was kind of cool. At this point, the head starts getting into the anglerfish phase, which I feel like every single miniature head that I sculpt as like a monster always ends up in this phase for a second. I also go and add some horns. Here I add a small horn at the chin, as well as adding a larger horn onto his snout. Once I have the right shape, rather than just leaving it like the teeth, I decided I would come in with one of my sharper tools to add a little bit of texture going up the horn. I then let all of that set and add what I'm pretty sure are technically gums. Whenever I see dragons opening their mouths, they've got this little stretchy, fleshy part that connects the two jaws, and having this part of the gums on this dragon be stretched like this really emphasizes how wide the dragon is opening its mouth. I then realized that on the skull part of this miniature, I hadn't really added much of a brow, so I go in with a little bit of green stuff and rectify that. I was a little scared to do this because I didn't want to repeat the problem of the last head that I had tried to make where everything was super flat, but I feel like I did a good job keeping it dynamic and avoiding the very flat look of the other head that I tried to make. The next step in the process was adding the rest of the horns. Some of the very classic horn designs for dragons are having two that go back from the brow. The trick with these was to try to figure out how to make sure that they were curving in a very natural way. So once I figure out the first one, I go in and repeat the same process on the other side. I decided I wanted this guy to have a lot of little horns because I always liked dragon designs that kind of threw them all over the face as a kind of mane almost of horns. So I add some to the corners of the jawline as well as surrounding that and the other horn that I added. The next step was by far the scariest. It was now time to add the final layer of skin over top of the face. Having messed up this process 2 times already, I wanted to make sure that I did it right, and this was the stage that was going to let me know if I had messed something up royally or if this was actually going to work. It's a very trust the process moment, and it was time to see if the process was deserving of my trust. So I start by doing the brow and then start by sculpting in the bags under the eyes to try to work on the expression first. Because the eyes play so much into how we perceive what a face looks like, it's important to get this step first. I finish it off by using a needle tool actually, as well as my rubber tools, to make sure that all the details are just right and try to get all of the kind of leathery folds into that part of the sculpt. Once I have that where I like it, I start to add more green stuff to do the rest of the skin around the teeth and mouth. At this point, I'm trying to think about and play around with how to make this look like the leathery scales of dragons that we're used to. Trying to make sure that the lips have a very well-defined line that's very evocative of dragon or dinosaur skin. I also try to make sure that I'm not covering up any of the shapes I was adding with the skull, but emphasizing them. Here you see I'm making sure you can still visibly see the cheekbones that we added underneath. At this point, I'm really worried about how I'm going to end up doing the scales for this guy. But the way that I did the scales was just by taking this little metal tool and adding tiny little dots into the green stuff. And this does a really great job of adding that scaly, kind of almost leathery texture of dragon skin without having to sit there with a needle and sculpt every single scale individually. You can just take your tool and just dot it all around the green stuff wherever you want the texture to be. And I would really suggest doing it around the horns, which helps it look like dragon skin not only in texture, but also in shape. I then repeat that process on the other side. And if I'm honest, I don't know if it's more stressful to do this for the first time or try to figure out how to do it all over again on the other side and make it look the same. I then add a little bit of green stuff onto the top of the head to blend the seams between the 2 sides, as well as adding a tongue into the mouth of this mini. With that, the head itself was finished, and it was time to make the rest of the body. The wire I'm using here is actually an aluminum wire, so it bends really easy, and it was really interesting to use for this project. I don't know that I would use it again. I would probably use a copper wire that isn't quite as hard as steel, but not quite as soft as this aluminum was. But I follow the same basic steps I do with most of my minis, adding the spine, then adding the arms and the shoulders in one piece that I glue onto the spine by looping the wire around it. But for the back legs, I added 2 separate legs rather than one long piece of wire for both, mostly because I miscalculated how long the wire would need to be, and so the first one I made was a little bit too small. But once I get those in place, I just put a little super glue on them and you'll never know the difference. Well, you will, but whoever's seeing it for the first time won't. Anyways, doesn't matter. I add some thinner wire to do the wings. This way they'll be a little bit more forgiving as I'm making the wings later on, which I anticipate is going to be very difficult and annoying. To flesh out the body, I add some tin foil so that I don't have to add too much material and it just saves me green stuff. As I'm doing this, I'm trying to think of this essentially as the rib cage, being careful not to make it too big because I am going to add a layer of green stuff over this. However, rather than just using green stuff, I also mix in some milliput. This is just going to help my green stuff go a lot further and is going to be better because I'm going to have to use a lot of this material to cover the entirety of this armature. So what I do is I take small sheets of the milliput and green stuff combination and just stick them around the miniature until it's all covered in this milla stuff. For the wings, however, I only add green stuff so they can bend and flex a little bit more. For some reason, I felt like that was a good idea for the wings, but there's a good chance that it would have been better if they were a little bit more solid. The next step on the body was to add some horns. I wanted to have this miniature be a fairly classic standard dragon, and the classic thing that most of these dragons have is a layer of spikes going down the spine. So I do the same thing I did with the horns on the head, but just adding them down the spine and down into the tail. Once I add all of those, I add a little bit more of the Milla stuff to flesh out the thighs of this miniature, because obviously they're going to be a lot bigger than the rest of the limbs. And then the dreaded task of trying to figure out how to do these wings. Honestly, I haven't done a dragon video exclusively because I was terrified of trying to do the wings. Here you can see me kind of fumbling and trying to add this wide piece of green stuff onto the armature that we made. Once it's loosely in place, I use a rubber sculpting tool to attach it more firmly onto the armature, and then I repeat the process on the other wing. I then actually take a craft knife and cut away at some of the extraneous details that I'm going to cover up later with more green stuff. And after that, I can move on to my comfort zone, which is doing anatomy. For this part of the wings, I essentially just treat it the same way that I would anatomy for an arm, except that obviously there's a wing. The way that the hand is going to work is essentially each of the little prongs within the wing are fingers. As well as working on the anatomy, as the green stuff is setting, I'm making sure that I go in with the back end of my metal tool and add in the texture that we've been adding for these scales. Here you can see I try to add one of the ligaments that's inside the wing, and unfortunately I do a fairly sloppy job. I try to correct it as much as possible, but here you can see I'm just kind of screwing with it and it's not staying very straight at all. And so later on, I'm going to cover up the wing with a little bit more green stuff to fix all of that. But then I repeat that whole process on the other wing. I also make sure to go over the edges of the wing with a little bit more green stuff to clean them up and add more of the scaly texture. Being a little tired and frustrated with the wings, I decided to move on to doing more anatomy, covering all of the legs with more of the same kind of anatomy that I would do for arms, especially for these front arms that we're doing here. Because of the additional limbs of having the wings, this miniature ended up being a lot of anatomy. And if you want to know anatomy, I do have an anatomy video that you can go check out. But once I had finished the two front arms, it was time to add some of the chest plating. This I used more of the Milla stuff that I had mixed together, and I try to get a loose triangle shape towards the top, and then I come in with one of my metal tools to add these little ridges or lines. The goal of these are to kind of look like these large scales, kind of husks that act as an armor for the creature's underbelly. So I blend the back side of that into the chest and then add another piece of this Milla stuff, and I repeat the process a few times to create a few layers of this. I then pluck up the courage to continue working on the wings, using an X-Acto blade to cut away at the extra pieces of green stuff that I had added when I was fumbling to try to make something loosely in the shape of a wing. I then, much more carefully than the first time, add the extra ligament in the middle of the wing on the second wing, and add this extra little piece of green stuff right here to make the wings look a little bit more natural. Then it was time to start filling in the gaps where there wasn't any green stuff or scaly texture on this guy. So I take a little bit of green stuff and just fill in those spaces, and be sure to go back over all of it, adding a bunch of the scale texture. I then start working on the hind legs, adding a very prominent joint at this section of the leg, as is kind of normal for these back hind leg, horse leg legs. As I work on this very last ligament, I also add a little bit of green stuff to act where the thumb would be for, because technically this last part is what our hands are. That's why there's an extra limb, for those of you who didn't know. A little anatomy lesson for horses and dragons, I guess. But the rest of the leg is fairly standard, adding all of the muscle groups and adding in the scale texture to make it look finalized. At this point, I noticed the tail was too long, so I took some pliers and clipped his tail a little bit, and in order to make sure that it came to a point still, I shaved off the excess material. Then I cover it in some green stuff, and rather than just making the shape of this into a tube, I try to make it a little bit of a triangle. For those of you who haven't noticed, whenever you have a lizard or a dragon, they always have this little ridge on the very top of their tail that would be following their spine, as opposed to just having a tentacle-like thing for a tail. Once this is finished, I clean up the cut edges of the wings by adding a little bit more green stuff. And then I had forgotten to add a little ridge onto the bottom of the wing to follow the ridge that I added on top. The last part of the wings was the hand, so I add a little bit of green stuff to make the hand a little bit more prominent, and then I start working on the fingers. So because I only have 2 ligaments inside the wing, to make it accurate I had to add 2 tiny little fingers onto these sides. This way, technically, while I feel like I don't like the choice of only adding the 1 ligament inside the wing, this is still a biologically accurate, fantasy creature, because who wants fantasy creatures that aren't biologically accurate, Then I add a little bit more green stuff, like I had mentioned earlier, to clean up the mess around the ligament inside that first wing that I had done. And also add a little bit more green stuff around the edges, like I had done on the last one. With that, the body was mostly finished, and it was time to add the head. So I just take a big wad of green stuff and stick it to the front, and loosely place where I want the head to be. I then take a little bit more green stuff to fill out the gaps between the shoulders and the head, trying to follow the loose muscle structure of what would be the neck. Once those muscles are in the place that I like them, I go in and add the scale texture that I've added throughout the rest of the miniature to unite the 2 pieces. The next step was to finally start working on the base. I take this large piece of foam to act as a large slab of stone that I then cut into shape onto half of the base, because the base was a little bit too small for the dragon. To add a little more texture, I cut in a couple little ridges, and I also take an aluminum ball and rub that all over the foam to create a nice stone texture. To attach it onto the base, I actually covered all of the foam in a varnish. I had a gloss varnish on hand, and this way I could actually use super glue to add it onto the base without the super glue just eating away at the foam, because it now had this protective layer over top of it. But be careful using super glue and foam, because it will eat away at it, and I assume that the chemical reaction and the toxins or whatever is probably not good to breathe in. To attach the mini to the foam, I take a little bit of wire and put it through some fresh green stuff that's still setting, since I don't actually have any extra wire to stick into the foam. I then start playing around with how I want to do the feet. This was actually really difficult. I could never get it quite the way I wanted to. It was always looking a little bit too human and a little off-putting. Eventually, I'm going to come back and redo this. The only detail I ended up keeping is this claw that I put in the back that's supposed to loosely resemble like a velociraptor claw. These back feet I did a lot better though. I take my rubber tool and my metal tool and loosely segment out some ligaments or like fingers into this tiny little piece of green stuff that I have here. But in order to do the claws, rather than just trying to sculpt them out of this piece, I go and take these tiny little piece of green stuff and stick them on top, which I then later on will go in with my rubber sculpting tool and set in place however they need to be. This creates a nice distinction between the claws and the feet themselves. I also add little claws onto the little lump that we added before. And here you can see me redoing the front feet that I'd added, doing them the same way that I did the back feet. Before I show you the finished sculpt, I want you to go check out my Patreon as well as my band. All the links for that are going to be in the description. Here is the final sculpt. I'm reasonably happy with it. I think there's a couple problems with it, but we'll address that more fully later on. I think the biggest thing that I'm noticing is the pose is a little dull. But either way, now it's time to go on to painting. I start by priming the miniature with a little bit of black primer that I add with a brush. And the first layer of paint that I actually decided to add to this is not purple this time. I add a mixture of the flat brown and the black from Vallejo Model Color because I wanted to paint this dragon red, the very classic standard dragon red. Those of you who have been on the channel before know that I have this habit of making all of my miniatures purple or purple-ish, so I wanted to make sure that this was something very, very different. I then take some of Vallejo Model Color's flat red and do a loose dry brush over the entire mini. This is going to act as the mid-tone for the miniature. Me personally, I like to always paint darkest tones first and then work my way up in highlights. Here I take a little bit in this very blurry video. I'm very sorry, I didn't film this very well. But I take some of the straight Vallejo flat red and I add the more intense highlights with a brush, since the dry brush only gets so much of the paint on the mini. As I add this highlight, I'm really trying to think about the direction of the lighting, so as I turn the mini and I do the other side of the face, I'm trying to add less and less of the highlight to create a little bit of a sense of the light coming from his right as opposed to his left, or his one side as opposed to his other side. I then move on to paint the wings, and I played around with a couple different colors. Here I added a pink that I didn't like, then I added a weird brown pink that I also didn't like. What I finally decided to do on the other wing was a mixture of purple paint and a mixture of brown. This created a nice dark light-ish reddish color that wasn't too pinky. On top of that, to make some dynamics into the color, I added a white that got brighter and brighter and brighter. It still ended up a bit of a pink, but in my opinion, it wasn't quite so hot pink as the other color was. So I go on the rest of the wings and do the exact same thing, and I add that same color onto the tongue and the gums. Then it was time to paint the teeth. I started painting them in this off-white yellowy color that I normally do for teeth because it makes a very good color for yellowed teeth, but later on I decided I would cover that up in a different color. I then start working on the horns. The first thing I need to do is cover up all of the red dry brush that I had done, since I wanted this base color to be some of the dark brown black that I had started this miniature with. So I make sure to go over all of the horns that are along the spine, as well as touching up the scales, the large armor scales that we had added on the stomach and chest of the mini. In order to add a little bit more interest, I mixed a little bit of white into the gray, black, brown that we had made to add a bit of a highlight color that I put over all of the horns and all of the armor plating. And then I liked this color so much, that was the color I ended up choosing for the teeth instead of the off-white. I also used this color for all of the claws, and then it was time to move on to the eyes. The eyes I decided to do a kind of piercing yellow, so I started by adding a layer upon layer of yellow, starting from a dark brown and getting brighter and brighter and brighter. Until I was just adding a dot of the brightest yellow onto the eye. This next part of the process I honestly wish I hadn't done. I drenched the entire miniature in a brown wash, which I feel like I've done this before, and it doesn't make the miniature nearly as glossy as it did for this guy, but for some reason he ended up being really, really shiny. And so I guess when people say don't cover your miniatures in a dark wash to actually focus on the details, this is why they're saying that, because it makes your miniature super shiny. I unfortunately didn't have a matte gloss to cover this in, but here you can even see it's already shiny. To finish up the base, I add a little bit of a dry brush of gray, and then the miniature is finished. I'm somewhat pleased with this miniature. I'm really disappointed about how shiny it is. Like, I know they tell you to not douse stuff in wash, in just like a dark wash, but dang, this is kind of disappointing actually. I think the sculpt is fine. The pose, like I said earlier, is okay. It could be a little bit more dynamic, and I think I'm really proud of the face. I think the face looks really good, but the wings are okay. Yeah, I think it's a good sculpt, but there's just a lot. Like, again, the paint job is just kind of like, yeah, the paint job makes me angry. I wish it wasn't so dang shiny. But other than that, I'm fairly pleased with it. At some point, I'm probably gonna have to come back to this and rectify it, make something a little bit better. But for a first try at a dragon, I'm reasonably pleased with it. But that's it for this video. If you enjoyed it, please subscribe, hit the bell, do all the algorithm-y things. Again, don't forget to check out my Patreon and my band. This is what one of our songs sound like.
And if not, it's enough that we both hate it here. So hold on, red wagon, into a strange kind of heaven.
So if you're interested, all the links are going to be in the description for that. Thank you so much for watching this video, and I hope to see you guys in the next one.
If I could